But I say to you, offer no resistance to one who is evil. When someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other one to him as well. If anyone wants to go to law with you over your tunic, hand him your cloak as well. Should anyone press you into service for 1 mile, go with him for 2 miles. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not turn your back on the one who wants to borrow. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. When I was a young man, as a teenager, I used to come to Catholic Family Land, and I loved it every year. And the message that I took away from it was the profound message of the Fatima message. And today we start with the first point of the Fatima message, which is that sin is the cause of all unhappiness in the world. Now, growing up in Maryland, it was always a big deal to go to New York City. That was a major trip. It was about a 4-hour drive. And so it may happen maybe once every 3 or 4 years. And so there was one time when I was a seminarian down in Maryland, and I was attached to this Catholic school. And so the 8th grade decided for their 8th grade trip, they were going to go to New York City. So I accompanied them. And it was a great experience, and we saw the Statue of Liberty and Empire State Building. And then we went down to Battery Park. And Battery Park is on the very southern tip of Manhattan. And it's a nice place to recreate and have a little picnic. But also, there's a lot of shysters there who have all sorts of goods that they're selling out of blankets that they just roll out there on the grass. And so this one kid named Alex from the 8th grade comes up to me and he says, guess what? I just got a Rolex watch for $10. I said, Alex, you know that's not a real Rolex. He said, of course it is. The guy told me it was real. Yeah, I mean, do you think he has perhaps some skin in the game to tell you it's real? So we go on, and then we hop on the bus, and we're heading back down. About 10 minutes into the bus ride, Alex comes up to me, and he says, my watch doesn't work anymore. Well, of course not, right? Because it's not a real watch. It's counterfeit. And when you pursue something that's counterfeit, you end up finding that it leaves you empty in the long run. And that is what sin does to us. Sin promises us happiness, but that kind of happiness is counterfeit. It's temporary. And when that happiness goes away, we feel empty. Why do we feel empty? Because we were made for so much more. How many of you out there have used the Baltimore Catechism, perhaps in your studies? Beautiful. I used the Baltimore Catechism growing up. I was homeschooled, and so that was pretty much my main religion text. And let's see if you remember the answer to the question, why did God make us? The answer is to know, love, and serve him in this world so we can be eternally happy with him in the next. That's the meaning and purpose of our life, to know, love, and serve the Lord here so we can be eternally happy with him in the next life. So if we pursue any other goal other than the one that we were made for, we're pursuing counterfeit happiness. We're pursuing something that leaves us empty. In fact, St. Augustine put it this way. He said, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. C.S. Lewis uses the analogy of a car, and he says, God made us. He invented us as a man invents an engine. And a car is made to run on gasoline. It would not run properly on anything else. Now, God designed the human machine to run on himself. He himself is the fuel that our spirits were designed to burn, and the food our spirits were designed to feed on. There is no other. That is why it's no good asking God to make us happy in our own way without bothering about religion. Because God cannot give us a happiness or a peace apart from himself, because it is not there. All right, so intellectually, we can acknowledge that sin is the cause of all unhappiness, but why do we still do it? It's because we have this little thing on our soul called concupiscence. It's one of the effects of original sin, concupiscence, a big word that simply means disordered desires. You see, our desires at the beginning of time, before Adam and Eve committed that original sin, was we desired God first above all else. And then we desired to love and serve our neighbor secondly. And then, in a distant third, we desired to gratify our own appetites. But now, because of original sin, that's all twisted in all sorts of ways. And now we desire things that we know are harmful to us. growing up in Maryland, I consider Maryland the South. Some of you may not, but Maryland, to me, was the South. And we had this restaurant called Golden Corral. Some of you may have been there. And Golden Corral is wonderful, and it's very aptly named because it really is a feeding trough for humans. And you go there and you get a plate that's a mound of food, you eat it, and there's some law that you have to get a new plate every time. So you end up getting like 7 empty plates on your table there. And you're just like sitting back, you're like, wow, that was amazing. Your buttons are popping off your shirt because you ate so much. But if you're like me, you then look up and see the pie table. And you realize, I haven't been to the pie table. I've got to go to the pie table. But you know that if you go to the pie table, it is going to hurt. You are going to be in physical pain. You may physically explode. But what do? We go to the pie table anyway. I can intellectually know that this is going to be a painful experience for me, that is going to give me about 30 seconds of pleasure and probably the next 6 hours of agony and moaning on the ground. But I do it anyway. This is concupiscence, right? It's this desire to do things that we know intellectually are harmful to us. You see, before the fall, prayer was more delightful than video games. Before the fall, broccoli was more delicious than chocolate. I know, right? Wouldn't that be wonderful if that was still the case? But now, after the fall, we desire things that we know are not the best things for us because we have this weakness of will that makes us desire things that do make us truly unhappy. And these desires really come in one of 3 ways: the world, the flesh, and the devil. These are what we call the 3 sources of temptation, the 3 things that promise us this counterfeit happiness, but end up leaving us empty. I want to tell you the story of a saint you've probably never heard of. Her name was Saint Hyacinta Mariscotti. I think I like her because she sounds like an Italian dessert. But what a wonderful saint. Saint Hyacinta Mariscotti was someone who realized the emptiness of the things of this world. When she was a teenager, she was exceptionally vain. She would literally spend an hour in front of the mirror, combing her hair, putting on the finest silk dresses. Her family was very wealthy. They were an Italian noble family from the late 1500s, early 1600s. And so she spent her time basically flirting with all the boys and going to parties. That was how she lived her life every day. And by the time she was 16, 17 years old, there was one particular young man in her village that she had her eye on. She said, "This is the guy for me. I want this guy to marry me." But back in those days, you didn't really date. Ultimately, the man had to ask for the parents' permission to marry the girl. And so this man started to show more and more interest in her. He started to come over to her family's house for Sunday dinner, spend time with her and her family, and she thinks, this guy's really into me. This is great. So finally, one day, the big day arrives, and the man takes the parents aside, and they have a little conversation in another room, and she thinks, this is it. She's finally asking for my hand in marriage. So they come out, and the parents say, "We have great news for you. This young man just asked to marry your younger sister." She was devastated. No, my goodness, my life is over. When I gave this talk to a group of teens one time, I heard a girl scream from the back of the room. She said, "That's relatable." Don't know what her love life is like. But so Hyacinta decided, well, if I can't have the man I want, I'm going to give it all up and become a nun. But in doing so, she took all of her worldly habits into the convent with her. And so instead of making her, back in those days, you actually had to sew your own habit to become a nun. But she sewed her habit out of the finest silk that money could buy. Rather than fasting, she had her family bring her in food, which she kept in a small chest in her room so she wouldn't have to fast. After fasting at meals, she'd go back and indulge her desire to eat. And while all the rest of the nuns would be praying, she would pretend to be sick so she could sneak off the convent grounds to go and spend time with her old worldly friends. She was unwilling to give it up for God. Finally, what ended up happening is she got very sick to the point that they thought she was going to die. And so they called in a priest to give her the last sacraments. And when the priest walked into her room and saw the chest full of food and saw the fine silk habit, he said, "What are you doing? Do you not realize that you have sworn to be a bride of Christ? And here you are living for the things of this world. You need to repent, otherwise your soul may be lost." All of a sudden, this kind of woke her up, and she realized, oh my goodness, what have I been doing? All this time, I've been trying to seek happiness in the things of this world, and in reality, they haven't led to happiness. And so she ended up recovering from that illness, and she gave away that silk habit, and she gave away all that food, and she started to practice penance, to fast, to pray, and to give up her former way of life, and she found a deeper joy in doing so than she would have if she continued on in the way of the world. And ultimately, it was the joy of everlasting life that she was able to obtain through her sacrifices. And so we've seen the temptations of the world, the flesh, and the devil that promise us happiness, but end up leaving us empty. And probably in our own lives, we can see the brokenness that comes from sin. For example, we see that sin breaks our relationships. You know, it's Pope John Paul II who said in his Theology of the Body that the opposite of love is not necessarily hate. The opposite of love is using, treating another person as an object, seeing them only as a mere means to an end. That means spending time with people because they're wealthy, or they're good looking, or they're strong, or they're popular, or they're rich. That means, not seeing them as somebody who's beloved of God, but rather seeing them in a worldly mindset, which says that, well, if you're tall and strong and good looking, then you're worth something. But if you're not worth anything. We've seen perhaps how sin breaks our families. We've seen maybe the effects of divorce in our families. Maybe we've seen families that don't train their children of virtue. I can tell you as a priest how many times parents come to me just weeping and weeping at the fact that their children are living a sinful lifestyle, maybe no longer going to church or cohabitating or addicted to drugs or alcohol. And it causes such division in the family. Even simpler things cause that brokenness in family life. When I was a young child, me and my brother had this tremendous rivalry. He was a couple years younger than me, but he was much better looking, he was funny, he was athletic, and I was kind of nerdy. And basically, we didn't get along at all. We fought the entire time, but I kind of thought, well, we're kids, when we're adults, we'll have good relationship. Guess what? It never really happened. And so we're still kind of fighting, even to this day, and there's a big division between us because of those small things, those small divisions between siblings that kind of started to then expand when we became adults. We see, for example, how sin breaks society. I mean, just look at the front page of the newspaper, and you can see how sin is so devastating, how there's school shootings and abortion and division and vitriol on every page of the newspaper. A couple of weeks ago, I took my parents down to New York City to see a Yankees game. And I'll tell you, taking the New York subway is a very interesting experience. You see the full cross-section of humanity. And my dad has Parkinson's disease, so it's hard for him to walk and to get around. And we got onto a very packed subway, and there was one seat that was open. It was all the way next to the window. And he asked if the gentleman could move so he could sit down. And the man said, "No, I'm not moving for you." And I thought, oh my goodness, here's my dad who's sick and needs to sit down, and the hardness of heart of some people causing that brokenness in society. We see how sin breaks our interior integrity. We no longer know who we are. A couple weeks ago, a young person in my youth group came up to me and said, "Father Joe, I need your advice. I've got a friend who thinks he's a cat. How can I help him?" I don't know, give him a litter box or something? I don't know, what are you supposed to do? How do you help somebody that thinks they're a cat? We don't even know who we are as human beings. What does it mean to be in the image and likeness of God? And sin ultimately breaks our relationship with God. St. Paul says in the book of Romans that the wages of sin are death. You may say, well, why are the wages of sin death? Well, consider this. Imagine that you're back in school if you're an older person, or if you're still in school. Imagine this. What would be the natural consequence of punching a classmate? Well, the natural consequence probably, if you go to a regular school, would probably be, maybe getting suspended, getting detention. But what would be the natural consequence if one were to punch a teacher? Whoa, well then all of a sudden your consequence is maybe to be expelled from school. But what would be the consequence if, you punched the president? Well, half the country would rejoice, but no, I'm just kidding, not really, that's not a good thing, we shouldn't rejoice in that. But the reality is, if you punch the president, you're getting arrested, you're getting tased by the Secret Service. So even though it's the same action, depending on who we offend, there's a greater or lesser consequence. What then would be the natural consequence of offending God? Well, since God is all holy, all perfect, all good, then to turn our backs on God the natural consequence is indeed death, as St. Paul says. Not only physical death, but the eternal death and eternal separation from God in eternal damnation. Also, consider if God is the source of all life and sin is turning our back on God, what are we choosing? We are choosing death. And so sin ruptures and breaks that relationship with God, which is that fundamental relationship that gives us life. In fact, Jesus says that without him, we can do nothing. Not without him we can do some things, or without him we flounder or we struggle, but no, without him literally we can do nothing. So we need that relationship with God to be solid and strong through grace. Otherwise, turning our back on him through sin means we are embracing death. And you know, that word, sin, in the Bible, comes from the Greek word hamartia, which literally means missing the mark. It's an archery term that when you're pulling back your bow and you're shooting for a target and you fall short or you go left or right, you're missing the mark. And who is the mark that we're striving to be like? Jesus Christ. Right, so a sin is falling short of being like Christ. I know a lot of times in our world we look around and we say, well, at least I'm better than that guy. You know, I'm not as sinful as that person out there or that group of people. But that's not who Christ calls us to be like. Not better than that or better than this person, but like Christ. And when we see that, we realize that, as St. Paul says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. This is the struggle that all of us have, both our own sin through our personal choices, the struggle of original sin, which all of us fight against, and the effects of sin that we see from our family, our friends, and our society. But even though this sounded really like a downer of a homily, talking all about sin and how it makes us miserable, there is good news. And that good news is that sin has been paid for by Jesus Christ. I'm not going to give that away because that's tomorrow's homily. But I think we can't understand the joy of a Savior unless we first understand what we need to be saved from. We can't recognize that we need a Messiah unless first we recognize that we are sinners. And St. Faustina gives us that glimmer of hope by saying, the greater the sinner, the greater the right they have to my mercy, says Jesus. The greater the sinner, the greater the right they have to my mercy. And so it is true indeed that sin is the cause of all unhappiness. Broken relationships, broken integrity, ultimately breaking that union with God where we find our deepest happiness. But alas, sin does not have the final word, because tomorrow we're going to hear about how grace and Jesus Christ won that victory over sin, which can now be applied to our souls through faith.